Hi guys, this ought to be the first lecture that you're watching for geography. Hopefully you're doing well. At least theoretically, we've already had an in-class discussion, so hopefully I've laid out for you what this online distance learning class is going to look like, but I think it would be best just to give you a refresher in this video. So if you've already heard this, I apologize. I'm obviously recording this before we've had our in-class discussion, so if I've repeated myself, I do apologize. So here's the general format of this class. Each week that we are in distance learning, at least for the next 2 weeks, possibly longer, I will create a central post on Google Classroom. Let's just call that the hub post. On that post, I will connect you to the videos. I'll have links to the videos. I'll have links to the worksheets that go along with the lectures. These are just basically questions to make sure that you watched it so that I can tell that you've at least paid attention and listened to the sound of my beautiful or annoying voice, depending on your perspective. I will also put links to the quizzes. And again, those quizzes are available anytime. They are open book, including the Guns, Germs, and Steel one, which is more objective. It's multiple choice mostly. So you can have your books for that, no problem. You can take those at any time during the week. I would prefer that you did the reading. I know that some of you perhaps skip the reading sometimes, but I think it would be helpful for that. In addition to that, any supplemental videos, things I think you might find interesting will be there as well. So just keep an eye on that. Finally, be aware that we originally in this class were scheduled to have a test by the time you're watching this, the following Friday, the second week of our distance learning Friday. Obviously, I decided that would probably be best to push that off. Now, if we go into a third week of distance learning, we're going to have to do that test anyway, and we'll work through that. Don't worry about it. But just in case, on the off chance that we come back after 2 weeks, I'd rather have the test in person. So that is a change to a syllabus. Speaking of which, each week I will post a syllabus on that hub as well that will have all of the week's assignments. As much as possible, I am intending to stick with our original schedule. So if you've got the original syllabus, if you're looking at RenWeb, at least theoretically, everything should still line up. Textbook reading that's due and all that stuff. But obviously, with the distance learning thing, we might have to make some adjustments. So I will make sure that's in your hand on Mondays. Remember that you can do all of this work as soon as you get it. So the second that the post is up on Sunday night or Monday morning, you are welcome to get started. So you can take your quizzes, you can listen to your lectures. That might put you in a situation where you've listened to the lectures before you even had an in-class discussion. That's fine. You're more than welcome to do that at your own pace. I do ask that you finish by Friday midnight, just like we would do for a normal paper or something like that. That's just so that I can grade over the weekend and see how you're doing and track you down if you're not done or anything like that. So do try and have that in by Friday. If you have some extenuating circumstance, like you've got the coronavirus or something, just shoot me an email, and obviously we can work with that. All right, with all that being said, let's dive into what I want to talk about today. We are talking about the Middle East, and that's where we're going to spend our time in these lectures. In our in-class discussions, obviously, we're going to talk about some things that I think are personally relevant to the United States. But in these lectures, I want to talk about the different countries of Middle East. Also, can I encourage you to get your Chromebook, maybe put me in one tab and get up Wikipedia and Google search some things while I'm talking, because there, I think, are some things that you could benefit from seeing, and you can use your search function to find all that stuff. So today we're going to talk about Iran, or as it's sometimes called, Persia. We're going to talk about the ancient history of Persia, and then we're going to talk about the modern history of Persia into the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is, of course, what it is today. And obviously, Iran for Americans is a nation that we have a rivalry. We would probably be correct in calling them our enemies. Certainly, they oppose us in the Middle East in various different ways. So I think they're a nation that we do need to understand. And as of when I'm recording this, they are also one of the nations hardest hit by coronavirus, and they're being devastated by an oil war started by Saudi Arabia. So they're probably in the news right now. If you're paying any attention to that news, you've probably heard about Iran a lot in recent days. So let's go all the way back to the ancient era, my favorite era, and I promise I won't spend too long talking about it, but we do really need to go back to that time. So obviously, Iran or Persia would have been one of the first areas inhabited after people got off the ark, and that is important. Interestingly enough, about 2000 BC or so, the area that we consider Iran was invaded by a group of people usually called the Aryans. Now, that is not the Nazi Germans, for the record. This is a people group that called themselves the Aryans that Hitler actually learned about, and so he decided to call his master race of Germans Aryans. But the original Aryans weren't German at all. In fact, more than likely, they were brown-skinned, not quite as dark as modern-day Indians, but close to it. Now, these Aryans are particularly important because they are going to spread in two directions. They are going to spread from the Caucasus Mountains between Russia and Iran, Turkey, and they're going to spread south through Persia and into India. And then we are going to have a group that spreads west into Europe. Now, why is that important? Because these Aryans bring several things to us today. Number one, they bring their language. They spoke a language that has been called, and this is a bit clunky, but this is what it's called, Proto-Indo-European. Okay, let's break that down. What does proto mean? It means before, the precursor to. Okay, great. Indo, what does that refer to? Refers to the subcontinent of India. European, Europe. Okay, so they spoke a language that is going to have characteristics that will later show up in all languages in Europe and most languages in India. And, importantly, Persia. Why is this important? Because actually, our language, English, is much closer related to Persian, the language spoken in Iran, than it is to Arabic. So Persian is actually a language that if you go back far enough, it was originally spoken by people very similar to us, and people could probably understand each other. In fact, if you were to go to study Persian, you would actually realize that you know some of the words. You just know some of the words. In fact, you can look up charts online. I encourage you to do this. English-Persian comparisons. You'll see some words in common, words that you know that developed from the same source originally. And it's very similar to how French and English have similarities. And even Sanskrit, you can't read Sanskrit because they don't use Latin characters, but actually the sounds of the words in Sanskrit and Hindi are related to English in some weird ways. Very, very, if you go way back in their language family trees, they're connected to each other, okay? That's important. The other thing the Aryans bring with them is this designation of Caucasians, okay? If you've ever had to mark a little bubble that says you're Caucasian, why are you a Caucasian? Well, because theoretically the Aryans came from the Caucasus Mountains, so you were Caucasian. That being said, you can tell that the term has run away from the reality because if you are from Iran or you are from India, you would also technically be a Caucasian, but you're certainly not going to mark Caucasian in the bubble because it really just means white at this point. But only half of the Aryans turned white. The other ones were dark. And by the way, why are Indians really dark? Why are Europeans really light-skinned? Well, two reasons. Number one, when they moved into areas, we have very clear evidence that they conquered people. So the Aryans that moved west were probably darker skinned, conquered a bunch of white people, hence their children eventually became white because that's what happens in war. Women get taken captive, there's babies, so on and so forth. And in the opposite direction, when they went south, there were darker skinned people there. They intermarried. They actually brought the average color back up, as far as whiteness or paleness goes. So that's why the two groups look very differently. All right, that was really long and extended, but that gives us the beginning of Persia. Persia is going to eventually rise as a very well-organized warlike state, although that takes a long time. In fact, Persia is relatively desolate. It's not quite nasty desert like Saudi Arabia, but it's certainly not a place that you would want to spend a lot of time. Most of the groups that lived in Persia were nomadic groups. They were famous for their large herds of horses. In fact, it's very possible that the horse was domesticated in this area. And so they're quite good at horse riding, but they don't really have a lot of organization. And that's going to remain true until the 600s and 500s BC. Now, previous to this, and we'll talk about this a little bit in later lectures, we've got a lot of organization going on in the middle of the Middle East. We have Sumer all the way back in the 3000s BC, approximately, obviously, depending on when the flood happens. All of the dating for that time's a little noodly. We've got Egypt, well organized between 3000 and 2000 BC, right? We've seen the pyramids. And then even later in the thousands BC, we have a whole bunch of empires. We have the Israelites, obviously. We have the Hittites. We have the Babylonians. We have Assyrians. We have the Egyptians, all vying for control with very well organized civilizations that are very large, have iron weapons. Really quite well organized. Now, the Persians do break onto this scene, but they don't break onto the scene in a unified way. In fact, the Persians began to be used by both the Assyrians and the Babylonians as mercenary shock troops. Specifically, the Bible actually gives us the name of the most prominent tribes, and that is the Medes and the Parsai, obviously translated in English as the Persians. Okay. By the way, the Persian language is called Farsi, which is probably closer to what they were originally called, the Farsians, but eventually the English turned that into the Persians. Now, the Medes and the Farsi, or the Persians, are eventually going to be unified by a great leader of the Persian tribe by the name of Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great is really important. I wish we had time to talk about him in detail, but he's one of the most important figures probably in world history. He's also important from a biblical historical point of view because he's going to dismiss the Jews from Babylon. He's actually the first person in the Bible to be called the Messiah. Okay, not as in the Son of God Messiah, but as a liberator of people, specifically the Jewish people, right? He sends them home back to their homeland, so he's Messiah. Cyrus does a couple of interesting things. Number one, he reorganizes Persia entirely, keeping that strong horse focus, but also settling people and moving people around his empire to locations that are good. He picks this up from the Babylonians. But Cyrus is going to create a system that is going to last in some shape or form really for approximately 1,200 years. And even then, when Islam takes over, I would say that in Iran, the Iranians took over Islam a lot more than Islam took over the Iranians. So what does Cyrus do that's so interesting? Well, there's several things that we should talk about. Number one, he creates the first system of mass conscription. And what is conscription? Conscription is calling up communities and requiring them to send soldiers to fight in your armies, okay? The United States is capable of conscripting people. We did that last in Vietnam. We certainly did it during World War II. This is a very common feature in modern societies, and it's done much better in modern societies. We have a lot of different criteria that we can use. If you've ever seen the first Captain America movie, you're familiar with some of our restrictions on a conscript, who we will take and who we will not take. But Cyrus kind of pioneers this technique. Here's the key to it, though. I mean, you might say to yourself, that sounds pretty simple. Why didn't anybody think of that before? Well, the problem is that typically in an ancient society, you have two groups. You have the in-group, who will probably fight for the ruler till their dying breath. And then you have the oppressed groups, who are willing to shank their masters in the thorax as quickly as possible if they get the chance. Let's just say that you've conquered a bunch of people and turned them into slaves. You've taken all their women as your handmaids and your wives. You've made them do physical labor tasks. Are you going to hand them an axe? No, because they're going to put it in your skull faster than they're going to swing it at your enemy. So Cyrus's key here is to treat the conquered peoples with incredible leniency, and he does that. Again, the Jews are just the most prominent example. He sends them home. He gives them gifts. Later Persian kings sent Nehemiah to rebuild walls. This is a general policy for the Persians. Any conquered group, they really invest heavily in, especially if it's a group conquered by somebody else that they then conquered. I mean, that's like easy bonus points. I mean, it's just a new guy in charge taking your tax money, but he seems nicer, so you like him. By doing this, Cyrus is able to assemble massive armies. And unfortunately, he's going to be killed in a military conflict with Queen Tomyris of the Scythians. Actually, she challenges him to one-on-one combat. Apparently, she beheaded him in a horse duel. A pretty tough chick, if I do say so myself. And supposedly she also then took his head, turned it into a drinking cup. So poor Cyrus, he's going to die. But the system that he creates for building an army is incredibly robust. And actually, those same Scythian horsemen have to run away the next year when the Persians show back up with a much larger army under the command of Cyrus's second in command, Darius of Daniel in the Lion Den fame. Another thing Cyrus had done before his untimely demise is he had created a system of organizing his empire that was radical. And in fact, the only place that had done this to any extent was Egypt, and it hadn't worked particularly well because most of the guys that were placed in charge tried to rebel against the pharaoh, and that was dividing his empire up into smaller units and then placing governors who were basically his representatives in those areas. He did this by dividing the Persian Empire into a huge number of units, and Darius would continue this process until there was approximately 127 satrapies. So satrapy was a unified area of the empire with a single guy in charge with his own military troops that could extract resources and then had to send those resources to the king. The difference, though, the reason why this worked as opposed to the Egyptian system, which was called the Nome system, that didn't work, and that's Nome, not Gnome, before you wonder. The reason that this worked so effectively is because Cyrus just had a monopoly on power. The satraps could throw together 10,000 guys. It seems like a lot, except Cyrus could throw together 1,000,000 guys. I mean, there's an exponential difference in force size here. So it wouldn't work. The satraps were also kept very divided. There's 127 of them. There's really no opportunity for one guy to get that much power because there's 126 other guys who don't want them to take power. So this system works quite well. Unfortunately, later Persian empires, especially after they were toppled by Alexander the Great, would lose track of why having 127 different satrapies, different rulers was effective. It really spread power out across a large number of people. Later Persian empires would have much fewer satraps or much fewer provisional governors. And then, of course, just like the Romans, a provisional governor gets enough power, he decides, why don't I become king? I'm a better king than the guy who's currently in charge. I'm going to take him out. And then you've got a civil war. So fortunately, that's going to be a problem later on. Now, the Persian Empire, of course, eventually goes and it falls. Specifically, it falls to Alexander the Great and his Macedonian and Greek troops. And after Alexander's death, Persia is one of the chunks of his empire that is fought over. The Persian Empire was also broken up in some ways at this time. The Persian Empire actually extended all the way down into northern India, modern-day Pakistan. Those provinces were actually sold by one of Alexander's successors for war elephants, no joke, 200 war elephants in exchange for all of the Indian provinces of Persia. Those war elephants did prove relatively useful because Seleucid, the guy who was ruling Persia after Alexander the Great, used them to win a number of battlefield victories and conquered more territory. So I guess it was a fair trade at the end of the day. So Persia is controlled by a guy by the name of Seleucid, which leads to the Seleucid Empire. It controls the area of Persia. It involves Persians, but it's actually a Greek empire. So we could say that the Persians disappeared for approximately 200 years, between about 300 and 100 BC. The Persians kind of are gone. Their territory is under the control of Greeks. Now, the Seleucids get beaten down by the Romans. In fact, the most embarrassing story about the Seleucid king is that he was going down to attack his rivals in Egypt, and a Roman senator showed up to negotiate peace and said, look, turn around, you're not allowed to attack Egypt. And Seleucid said, well, I disagree with that. And the Roman senator drew a line in the sand around him and then said, okay, well, why don't you think about it? And when you walk across that line, I'm going to expect a decision. And if you don't do the thing we want, we'll kill you. And obviously he has to step across the line and say, no, we'll go back. So the Seleucids go down in about 100 BC. Much of their Mediterranean land is consumed by the Roman Empire. But in their weakness, the Persian provinces, which are still ethnically Persian, they still speak Farsi, they decide it's time to go it alone. And so they throw off the rule of these Greek speakers, and they kind of create another Persian empire. And this is called the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire in many ways goes back to the roots of the Persians. They're excellent horsemen. They're excellent warriors on horseback. In fact, they give Rome an incredibly embarrassing defeat at Cana, where they actually defeat Crassus, one of the most powerful men in Rome, in the Roman Republic. And he was famed for being excessively rich. And the story is they killed him by taking a pot of molten gold and pouring it down his throat. And they killed him that way. So a little bit of irony there on how the Persians acted. The Parthians would prove to be the most robust and strongest nation that opposed Rome, although they weren't really on Rome's level. Sometimes if you read a history of the ancient world, it sounds like the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire were these great rivals that could fight against each other. The reality was not that the case. The Parthians were much weaker, but they were an independent empire that Rome never conquered. The reason Rome never conquered them is it was simply too far away for them really to get control of. Now, all that being said, Rome did eventually defeat the Parthians. I wouldn't say conquered them, but it did defeat the Parthians in 100 or so AD under the Emperor Trajan, and he actually marched into the capital of the Parthians and overthrew them. So we do have a defeat by the Romans of the Parthians. But eventually, that's actually going to lead to an even more powerful group taking over called the Sassanids. The Sassanid Persians were even more well organized, and they hearkened back to some of Cyrus the Great's old models, and they would actually oppose the Roman Empire all the way until their own destruction. Now, let's talk about the medieval period and the rise of Islam. Obviously, in approximately 700 AD, the forces of Islam pour out of Saudi Arabia, and they begin to attack everything in their path, including the Sassanid Empire. The Sassanid Empire had been attacking the Eastern Roman Empire for decades, and because of that, its economy was weak. The royal line only had one heir, and he was killed on the battlefield by Muslims. And soon enough, Islamic leadership had installed itself in Persians, and they had thrown the native Persians out of power. The problem is that Persia is big, it's robust, it has a very sophisticated culture and art and history. And after approximately 200 years of Muslim rule, the leader in Persepolis was more Iranian or Persian than he was Arab, because as intermarriage had occurred, they had become less and less and less Arab. They spoke less and less and less Arabic, and they organized themselves less and less and less in an Arab manner. This becomes especially important as the ruling caliph of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq begins to bring in Turkish warriors to give himself power. The leadership in what we would call Iran realized that they probably were going to be ousted soon and controlled by these Turkish groups under the command of the Arabs. So they decided to kind of revolt and go their own way. And this takes a long time. It's kind of a guerrilla war that extends for several hundred years. We don't have time to get into it. But at the end of it, they do manage to kind of establish their own empire, their own rule, which ironically is because the Turks do such a good job of taking the Arabs out. Eventually, by about 1500, there's really only two Islamic games in town. There's the Turks and the Ottoman Empire, and there's the Iranians that kind of survive in the Iran area. Now, in the middle of that, there's Mongol invasions. There's a group called the Timurids. There's Asiatic Mongols that move into northern India. So there's a lot of complexity that unfortunately we just can't get into. But we have a modern Persian dynasty in approximately the 1500s. The Persians are involved in the great conflicts between European powers, specifically the conflict between Russia and Great Britain in something called the Great Game. Persia was trying to decide which of the two nations to ally with, and eventually it's going to generally pick the British, although that takes a while. Now let's jump into World War I and II, and we're almost in the modern era. I know it's been a long time since we started this lecture, but just stay with me. In the modern era, Persia really was undecided on what to do. The British invested heavily in Persia to extract oil. The United States was investing in Saudi Arabia. The British decided to invest heavily in Iran, and eventually the leader of Iran, called the Shah, became a staunch Western ally. In fact, after World War II, when Iran had kind of been on the fence because of its proximity to China and Russia and India and all of these warring powers, it had tried to stay as neutral as possible. After the war, they became increasingly Western. And in fact, the Shah put into place a number of things to modernize Iran. In fact, if you look up images from not too late, 1976, 1977 Iran, you probably would be amazed on what you see. Women walking around the University of Tehran with jeans on and bright blouses and stuff like that. Their hair flowing in the wind. Nothing like modern day Iran or Middle East at all. So there's an intense westernization of Iran up until about 1978. In 1978, there's several problems. Number one, the Shah had been linked to several corruption schemes. He was probably doing some underhanded stuff and keeping himself in power. And he ended up deposing a very popular prime minister who had been calling him out on these things. That prime minister's ousting unfortunately gave an opportunity to another group that had been waiting for an opportunity, and that was the radical Islamic groups that wanted to restore Iran to its Islamic heritage. This group was led by Ayatollah Khomeini, And in 1979, there is an Islamic Revolution. Now, the Islamic Revolution was partially armed by the Soviet Union, as you might be able to guess, because it's connected to the West. The Soviet Union doesn't like the West, so they're going to arm these guys. And so, for almost 2 years, the Shah and these Islamic forces fight. And this is really the beginning of the Islamic warfare techniques of the modern era. These people were willing to destroy themselves, suicide bombs. They had almost no fear. They were willing to hold out and fight for unreal amounts of time. And Iran had significant weaponry and firepower, but the people increasingly turned against the Shah until by the end of 1980, the Shah was forced out of the country and he would never return. The 1979 revolution completely changed Iran, not only economically, because they lost their connections with the West, but it also changed them culturally. By the way, one of the reasons they lost their connection with the West is because they chose to kidnap American ambassadors and hold them in the embassy of Tehran, which is a famous story from the Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan years. Jimmy Carter really didn't know what to do about this situation, and Ronald Reagan ordered an attack basically at the very beginning of his presidency and got those people out. So there's a lot of complexity. Since then, the United States has maintained a policy of blockade with Iran. We allow very limited commerce. We have significant economic sanctions, which we increase or decrease depending on Iranian behavior. And you might have read earlier, just a few months ago, when Iran attacked in response for us killing several of their generals. Basically, the United States slapped down incredibly heavy sanctions. Now, modern Iran, let's talk about it. Modern Iran is probably the most heavily Islamically controlled nation in the world. Muslim Quranic law is the law there. And people in Iran are heavily oppressed by a Islamic government that is really more of a socialist state-run government. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard is basically the controlling power there. There have been moderates, but normally they are not able to do very much. The Ayatollah, the leading religious leader, is also one of the most powerful men in the country. He can effectively make policy decisions for them. And unfortunately, because of all of this stuff, the average Iranian has been in a tough place for the last 40 years. The economy of Iran has slowed its growth almost to a standstill, leaving it from one of the wealthiest nations in the Middle East to one where the people themselves are fairly poor. The government runs these huge state oil companies, but very few nations buy from them extensively. Of course, oil being so important, many people are willing to sacrifice their principles to buy from them, but still, most of that money goes right into the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. It does not go to any of the people because it's state-owned, and they're not going to spread that wealth out to their people at all. That being said, in the last 10 years, since the United States has really started to dial up sanctions on them, the economy of Iran has been particularly bad. And Iran has had to deal with several geopolitical rivals. From 1980 to 1988, Iran was involved in a war with Iraq. Iraq and Iran went to war. It's called the Iraq-Iran War. I know, brilliant name, where they were fighting each other. And actually, Iraq invaded Iran and took significant pieces of territory until they were eventually pushed back. And unfortunately, one of the reasons for that was a very messy event called the Iran-Contra affair, where the United States was selling weapons to the Iranians to fund guerrillas in Nicaragua. It's complicated. If you're interested, look it up. There's some great documentaries on it. But part of the reason that Iraq didn't win that war is because we were supporting Iran, which is ironic because we don't like Iran very much. The Iranians have also been beset by problems with their northern provinces, specifically inhabited by the Kurds. The Kurds are a large ethnic group spread out between 4 different nations without their own homeland. In fact, if good borders had been made, Kurdistan would have probably been created. But unfortunately, the Middle East was divided up by World War I superpowers, and they did a particularly poor job. So Iran has been dealing with this Kurdish population, and there are tales of atrocities and slaughter of those people in their northern provinces. And then there's also stories of the Kurds fighting back. So who knows what's going on there? Obviously, Iran would like not to say. In very modern times, Iran has been afflicted by the coronavirus. In fact, it has one of the worst coronavirus outbreaks. This is made especially difficult because of the falling price of oil. The Iran economy is based on oil. It's what brings most of the wealth into the nation. So as oil prices are falling, coronavirus entered, there is some extreme pressure in Iran. And for all we know, we could see a downfall of the current communist regime sooner than we might think. That's all I have for you guys on Iran. I encourage you to look up any information that you thought was interesting. Look into what Iran is doing. It's really quite an interesting place, complex place, to say the least. Probably not some place that you're going to travel in your lifetime. I mean, there's some cool things there, but unless the regime changes, I think that would be fairly difficult. Hopefully, you've enjoyed this lecture. Remember that there is a total of 3 lectures during the week, so try not to leave them until Friday night or anything like this. Remember, there's also a worksheet attached or connected to, I should say, to this lecture. So it'll say Lecture 1 worksheet. That'll just have some questions from this lecture to make sure that you were listening and paying attention. So make sure that you get that done. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next lecture.